Earlier this week, I went out to photograph the Lagoon Nebula with my dedicated astro camera and narrowband filters. There was one difference though this time, and that is we're almost to the full moon. So there's a lot of moonlight out, and that caused some unique challenges, but also some unexpected benefits. In this video, it's going to be more laid back. I'm just going to walk through what I did here in the ASIAir Pro app. So for those of you who got one or you're thinking about getting one, this might be a good look at the application and how everything works. I'm also going to discuss some of the problems I encountered. That way you don't make the same mistakes I did. And then at the end of the video, we'll see how the final image turned out. Of course, the first thing I did was my polar alignment. And this was actually very easy with the moon being out because it washed out all the fainter stars. As soon as I looked through the polar scope, I could see a big bright star, which was obviously Polaris. So I got my polar alignment within probably 2 minutes or less, really precise. Then I started up the ASIair Pro and began focusing my SpaceCat telescope with the Batinov mask. That way, I could do an even more precise polar alignment here in the application. However, this brings me to the first and most important mistake I made all night. I did not focus my hydrogen alpha, oxygen, or sulfur filters. So just to be clear here, as you swap your filters, it's going to change the focal point of your telescope. So you might have it perfectly focused here with the L filter, but if you swap over to hydrogen alpha, the stars may no longer be sharp. And that's the problem I encountered. The other thing that goes along with this is that when I was trying to find the Lagoon Nebula, there were no big bright stars to focus on like you see here. That meant the Batinov mask was pretty much useless, and I just had a heck of a time getting everything sharp with my narrowband filters. So looking ahead, when I try this again on another night, I'm going to swap over from the L filter to my hydrogen alpha or my sulfur, one of those, and make sure I get the focus precise there if I know I'm going to be doing narrowband. That would make a lot of sense because, again, once you find your object, there might not be any bright stars over in that region to focus on. Once I had focused my telescope, I was ready to do my precise polar alignment here in the ASIair Pro app. And this is one of the great things is that if you're not quite sure if you did the visual alignment correctly, you can always use the app to double check. So if you click Preview in gold, then you could choose PA from the list over on the right. At this point, what's going to happen is that provided your telescope is pointed up to the North Celestial Pole, then it's going to take a photo, analyze the stars that it sees, and figure out where it's actually pointing. Then it wants you to take a second photo. So you loosen your clutch, move the camera and everything down, almost like you're balancing the counterweight, lock it into place, and then you take another photo. It analyzes the scene, looks for the stars. Finally, it's going to compare those two images and see how things have rotated. And really nicely, it's going to show you to move up, down, left, or right on your base to get a precise polar alignment. And as you can see there, my total error was only 6 arc minutes. Usually that's what I try and get down to using the application. So the fact that I got my polar alignment so accurate with just the visual polar scope in the SkyGuider Pro was a good sign because I've always struggled with this in the past, but lately I'm really starting to get the hang of doing a visual polar alignment. And to be honest, normally I tell people just to leave it be. If you get within 10 arc minutes, that's usually good enough polar alignment for what we're doing, unless you're shooting above 600 millimeters. So honestly, I mean, as you're going to see here in a second, my polar alignment was really good. Then I tried to get it a little bit better, and I made things way worse. That's very typical. When you adjust anything when you're that close, more often than not, you're going to overdo it, and you could spend 10 minutes just trying to get it a little bit better. So like I said, normally if I can get down to 5 or 6 arc minutes of total error, I'm happy with it. But in this case, I figured might as well just go for it. And after a couple of attempts, I finally got it down to, I think it was like 1 arc minute, and then ZWO, or rather the application was happy and it let me stop. And one of the cool things about this application is that it actually ranks your total time to get a good polar alignment, which you see right there. And I remember I was teaching a deep space workshop back in November, and one of the students actually got a really high ranking. And this was only like his 3rd time doing a polar alignment. So that's always fun to see if you do a really good job in a short amount of time. Once I had completed my precise polar alignment, my next goal was to find the object that I wanted to photograph, in this case, the Lagoon Nebula. Now, normally this would be very simple because it's in the core of the Milky Way, it's fairly bright, and it's not that hard to find. However, the problem I had is that moonlight from the nearly full moon was washing out all the brighter stars in the nebula and the Milky Way itself. So what I decided to do was use an app called Stellarium on my smartphone. So I zoomed in the Lagoon Nebula, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at here, right in the core of the Milky Way. And then One of the cool things here in the app is that you can change the Milky Way brightness. I wanted it to match what I was seeing with my naked eye. That way things would be a little bit more easy. So down here where it says Milky Way brightness, I just turn it down. And that's realistically about what it looked like to the naked eye on the night, and even that's a bit bright. Then what I decided to do was look for those bright clusters of stars, like we have Antares over on the right, and I was just correlating what I saw in the app with what I was able to see with my naked eye and use those bright stars to help align to the Lagoon Nebula. And I ended up using this star right here as kind of my guide star. So I was able to see that one with my naked eye along with all those other ones. And I knew, okay, if this is where I'm looking at, I need to go over to the right and up a little bit, and the Lagoon Nebula will be right there. At this point, I turned on my laser pointer, which was rubber banded around my telescope, and I moved that around until I was right where I thought the Lagoon Nebula would be. And I took a photo here in the application. I remember the first time I did this, I thought I captured an amazing comet or something, and I realized it was just the laser pointer in the frame, but kind of makes for a cool photo even just doing that. So at this point, really all you have to do is just keep referring back to Stellarium for those stars, looking up with your naked eye, and using the laser pointer to get as close as you think you can to where the object should be. And sometimes it actually helps to put on the hydrogen alpha filter when you're photographing nebula, because it'll really stand out like a sore thumb. The image will be a lot darker and grainier, but if you have the nebula in there, in most cases it'll really show up with the H alpha filter. And for those of you who have the go-to mounts, you're saving yourself a lot of time and headache. You just type in Lagoon Nebula and it'll go right to it. You can even do that here in the application if you have Sky Safari. Those all work together with your go-to mount if it's compatible. Once I finally get a go-to mount, I will do some videos on that because I think it's really cool. But as of right now, I'm just still using the ASIAir Pro. As you see here, after a decent amount of time, I found the Lagoon Nebula using the L filter. And just to make sure that was correct, I swapped over to the hydrogen alpha filter, and I got an even better look at the nebula. Now, once you get the object somewhere in the frame, obviously your next goal is to get it centered up. So that's where you're going to adjust your right ascension and declination axis on your ASIAir Pro. And between those two axes, you'll get the object down towards the center. This can be more difficult than it needs to be often, but with a little bit of work, you'll get it right where it needs to be. And in my case, I accidentally moved my whole right ascension axis when I was trying to, I think, put on the Batinov mask. So everything jumped in the frame. That tends to happen quite a bit just because that clutch, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to completely lock down my ASIAir Pro. So in this case, I had to spend even more time getting it back to the center. And then, as I said, I put on the Batinov mask. So I was trying to refocus with the hydrogen alpha filter, because every time you swap filters, you do want to double check the focus. But you're starting to see how, as people have mentioned, if you had a go-to mount and everything, maybe one of those electronic focusers, it would make your night theoretically a lot simpler just because it's handling a lot of this manual stuff that you can waste a lot of time doing. And here, if we zoom in, this is with the Batinov mask on, but you don't see that iconic star pattern because the stars are not bright enough. This is what I was getting at earlier in the video, where I should have done this when I was pointing up at the North Star, which is a really bright object. That way I could have ensured it was focused before I moved over. Another problem I had is that I was running out of time. I woke up at about 2:45. Took me about 30 to 45 minutes to get everything set up and ready to go at this stage. And that only left me with about an hour to capture my hydrogen alpha, sulfur, and oxygen photos. Not really a lot of time. So eventually I said, you know what? I got the focus as close as I can get. I can't waste any more time. I need to start imaging. And that's why I eventually just kind of gave up, took off the Batinov mask, and started imaging. And I think right about here is about as sharp as I can get it. Like I said, if I could go back in time, I would have pre-focused on the North Star. That would save me a lot of time and headache. And then once I found the object, I'd be ready to go. Once you've got your object centered up and you're ready to start taking your photos, the last thing we always want to do is start up our guiding software. That way our star tracker runs a lot more accurately. And in this case, I ran into another problem. My guide scope wasn't completely focused. I mean, I probably could have left it where you see right there, but I wanted to make sure it really was on the money. So I tried to refocus my guide scope, and this ended up wasting about another 5 minutes of my night because I didn't know which direction to turn it. It made the stars look worse, then I had to go back. I just kept doing this back and forth for, like I said, about 5 minutes. Eventually, I said, good enough, and then I was ready to begin my guiding. And that allows me to get anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 times longer exposures without star trails on my SkyGuider Pro. It really is remarkable how well the guiding works. So for those of you who don't have an auto guider yet, it really is recommended if you're going to be doing any kind of deep space work. For those of you who have used PhD2 on your laptop, the ASIAir guiding software is almost exactly the same. You connect your equipment in the app, you begin looping, you click on any star you want, and then you click the begin guiding button, which is that grayed out little crosshair icon on the right. At that point, it's going to do a calibration. And this is why you always want to save your auto guiding for the very last step, because it's going to calibrate to exactly where you're focusing on in the night sky. And as you can see, it goes like west step 1, 2, 3, 4, usually up to 12, 15, or 20. Then when it's gone far enough west, it'll go back to the east. This is only if you have the SkyGuider Pro or the Star Adventure, though. We can only do our guiding with our right ascension axis. If you had a go-to mount, this would take even more time because it can also guide your declination axis. So for most of us, if you're using a star tracker, this shouldn't take more than a minute or two. Those yellow lines, if everything worked properly, will turn green once it goes down to E step 0. And at that point, the auto guider will send commands to your star tracker and try and keep that star centered up in that little box. In our case, if you do have a SkyGuider Pro or Star Adventure, essentially all it's doing is telling the star tracker to speed up or slow down very briefly to keep that star centered up. Since we don't have a declination axis, we can't control it, so it tends to just drift off on its own, depending on how accurate your polar alignment was. And if you're completely new to auto guiding, you need to understand this graph here where it has 0, 4, and 8 seconds. There's also -4 and -8 seconds. Those are arc seconds. They're used to measure accuracy at night, and it's really going to depend on the pixel size of your camera and the focal length of your lens or telescope that you're using. The smaller your pixels and the larger your focal length, the more accurate your guiding has to be. Pretty obvious. There's a whole equation you can do. I've got an article on my website. I'll probably have a pop-up for that if you want to learn more about that. But it's really important you understand what's going on there. The very last step I had to do before I could begin taking my series of images was find my maximum shutter speed without star trails. And in this case, I tried for a 3-minute long exposure because there was no real wind out there. My polar alignment was very accurate, and the guiding seemed to be working well. So I figured at a 500 millimeter focal length equivalent with my SkyGuider Pro, everything was well balanced. I should have no trouble shooting 3 minutes, but I had to verify that rather than wasting time. Although you could argue it is a waste of time to sit here and test it, especially given the fact that I was running low on time. Anyway, I let it run, and then once it completed, I checked the preview, zoomed in, and made sure everything looked good. And rather than use the typical auto run feature, I wanted to try the live stacking option here in the ASIAir Pro. This is something I haven't done before. I've only read a little bit about it, and I figured I'd give it a try. So the first thing you want to do is select your shutter speed, in my case, 3 minutes. Then you can specify if you're taking lights, flats, darks, or bias. And it's really important here that you save all frames when stacking. In case something goes wrong, you can still do things the old-fashioned way if you check that box. And one of the weird things about live stacking that I thought is that, with our typical workflow, we take our light frames first, and then at the end of our imaging session, we take our dark frames and our bias frames and maybe our flat frames as well. And then we throw all that into our stacking software in Deep Sky Stack or whatever we're using, and it calibrates all those frames. One side note here, I also turned on my cooling. I wanted to make sure I did that before I started my final imaging session. And there was no point turning it on beforehand because I wasn't doing anything important. But now that I'm taking my photos for real, if I turn on that cooler, it's going to help to reduce some of the noise. And if you look at the bottom of the frame there, it says it goes temp 11 degrees Celsius. And I waited until it got all the way down to -10. Getting back to the live stacking though, what I was getting at is that when you live stack, you actually have to do things in reverse. You have to take your darks, flats, and bias before you can take your light frames. And I thought that was kind of weird. After messing around with the app a little bit more, I realized there's an alternative way to do things. So in the center of the screen, you see flat, dark, and bias. If you click on one of those, it'll allow you to go into the flash drive's memory and find some previous dark frames or bias frames or flats that you've already taken. In this case, I can click on my first dark frame and select it. I would have thought you could select more than one, but for some reason, you can only select a single dark frame. then you could check the box to apply that to your live stack. And you can repeat that process with the bias frames if you want to do that. However, for the bias frames, you have to make sure mainly that the gain stays the same. So you have to use the same gain from night to night in order for the bias frames to be effective. If you took your bias frames with a completely different gain, this will not work. And for your dark frames, you have to have the exact same exposure, the same gain, and the same sensor temperature. If any of those three things aren't the same from when you took your dark frames till when you're taking your light frames now, they will not be subtracted properly and they'll actually cause more problems than they solve. But at least here in the ASIAir Pro app, it's going to show you how long this whole thing's going to take to complete. And you can also change the amount of flat frames that you want to integrate. So you can do 5, 10, 15, or 20. And if they were 5 seconds long, each one of your flat frames, that would take 25 seconds in this case. Same thing with dark frames. However, with my dark frames, those need to be the same exact shutter speed as my normal light frames, in this case 180 seconds. And you don't want to take 5 or 10 dark frames, that's not really going to work that well. Usually, according to my research, you want a minimum of 15, if not 20 dark frames for the best results. And therefore, if I was doing 180 seconds, I think if you did the math, it would take me an hour just to get all my dark frames. And I don't have time to do all that, I need to be capturing light frames. So that's one of the problems I have with this live stacking thing, is that it wants you to do all this stuff before you can take your light frames. Therefore, rather than waking up 2:45 in the morning, I would have had to wake up at like 1 in the morning or just pull an all-nighter. That way I can take my flats, darks, and bias ahead of time, and then finally I can begin capturing my light frames. So for me personally, in my shooting scenario, I don't understand live stacking. For me, it doesn't make sense because I'm all about capturing my light frames immediately and then worrying about darks and bias if I want to do those. And as I showed you earlier, you could always apply your flats, darks, and bias that you took from another night if the camera settings you're using then and now match. But it looks like you can only use one at a time, so I still need to do more research before I can say if that works well or not. And thankfully I did click that checkbox for save all frames when stacking. Otherwise, as you'll see here, I would have wasted the whole night because it turns out I think I did some stuff wrong here with the live stacking. So once you have everything ready to go, then you pretty much just click that circular button over on the right. It's going to start taking, in this case, 3-minute long exposures with my hydrogen alpha filter, and you can let it run as long as you want. The more photos, the better. And ideally, like I mentioned, you would have already taken your darks and flats and bias. That way you could calibrate each frame as it's taken and stack it here in the application. That way you don't have to do this later in Deep Sky Stacker or whatever you want to use. And this is always my favorite part about shooting with a hydrogen alpha filter, is that when that first photo finally completes, it's amazing what you can capture. You'd never be able to get anything like that with anything else. So it is a lot of fun when you're photographing these nebula to use those narrowband filters and just capture all that incredible detail that otherwise is usually pretty hard to capture effectively. Once I had captured 7 images with a hydrogen alpha filter, now I need to stop the live stack and move over to one of my other narrowband filters. In this case, I clicked up on my little filter wheel button and went to my oxygen filter. That way I could begin a live stack with that filter on and do another 7 images. This is where I made my critical mistake though, in that I did not save the final stacked image. I thought it was going to be just saved automatically to the flash drive. However, you need to make sure that before you start a new imaging sequence, you click the download button there in the lower right with the downward arrow. If you forget to click that download button after your first series of images, you will no longer have this final stacked photo. You'll only have the individual frames if you check that box right there, which I told you to earlier in the video. And I didn't realize this at the time, so I really shot myself in the foot. Then what I did, in this case, I swapped over to the oxygen filter already. I clicked the circular button and I hit restart. That way I could stack all my oxygen images separately, just like we would do in Deep Sky Stacker or anything else. But when I click restart, it just killed that completely stacked photo that we'd been working on. So I pretty much wasted my time in some sense. So my whole point here is that you got to make sure you click that download button. Otherwise you won't have the live stacked photo saved to your flash drive on your ASIAir. And I even went in here to the folder structure to see if that was accurate. And that's when I realized that all I had were the 7 individual frames, not the final stacked. And that's when I was, oh crap, I must have forgotten something. So if nothing else, hopefully you don't make that mistake as well. Another thing you want to pay attention to is the fact that it says whirlpool. I misspelled whirlpool a couple nights ago, but what I'm getting at here is that when you use the live stacking feature, there's no way to name the series of photos that you're taking in terms of the object. So if you're going to be doing live stacking, go to the auto run feature anyway and change that from whatever it was before to what you're photographing tonight. That way the naming structure lines up properly. So in other words, the live view is just going to refer to whatever you had set as your object name in the auto run submenu. All right, so let's head over to the laptop now. We'll take a look at what I actually captured, and then I think we'll call it a day. So we have the Lagoon Nebula folder here, my light frames, and thankfully I checked that box when I was doing the live stacking. That way I actually had the individual frames. If I wouldn't have checked that box, all I would have had is a single stack of sulfur images, because that's the only time I remember to click the download button like I showed you. So at least I have this we can compare to. If we head over to Deep Sky Stacker, you'll actually see what I'm talking about. Here is a single 180-second exposure with a sulfur filter. If I adjust things, you can kind of see what's going on. Really not that much detail with that filter. Now if I swap over to the stacked version with 7 sulfur images, we have this. So that's what the ASIAir Pro did in the application. That's ideally what you would have had if you did everything correctly. As I mentioned though, I really screwed things up and I had to do things manually on my own. So the way I did that is I went to open picture files and I just grabbed my 7 hydrogen alpha frames. And these actually turned out really well. I mean, I think that looks awesome. I love doing H alpha stuff. But once I had my 7 hydrogen alpha frames, I also took my darks and my bias. And I took these at the end of the night during twilight because I couldn't shoot anymore anyway. That's the perfect time to do my dark and bias frames rather than before. Like I said, I don't really understand live stacking because why would I waste my time taking darks and bias when I could be capturing data? So again, there might be something I'm overlooking, but for me, live stacking doesn't make sense for my shooting scenario. So there's the darks. I also did 100 bias during twilight, had everything covered up, and there we go. Now, you should already know how to use Deep Sky Stacker. I've covered this in some of the other videos. So I hit stack, check pictures. I had about 21 minutes of data for each of my 3 narrowband filters. Once I stacked them all together separately, then I had sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen alpha, the final tips. Let's take a look at these closer, and then we'll call it a day after that. So I'm just going to stretch these out very quickly until we can see that data. And you're probably already noticing one of the problems I made. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but let's get everything stretched first. Okay, so we have sulfur, oxygen, hydrogen alpha. I did hydrogen alpha first, then oxygen, then sulfur in terms of the imaging sequencing. So what I'm going to do is put these all in the same workspace. That way we can really see what's going on. All right. Look how blurry those stars are. I mean, that's almost completely useless. Not even the fine detail can be used because I mean, it's completely blurred out. That's with sulfur, I think, might be oxygen. That one's a little bit better, but the stars are still completely blurred out. Hydrogen alpha, they're fairly sharp, but it's still not as sharp as it should be. And that brings us all back to the very first problem I said at the start of the video, where when I was aiming at this region of the sky with my Bahtinov mask, there was nothing bright enough for me to focus on. And since I'm using a ASIAir Pro, I couldn't just say go to wherever I wanted with a bright star. Therefore, my life was a lot more difficult. I couldn't get the focus done. I ended up wasting about an hour because none of this data is usable as far as I'm concerned. It's too blurry. So I think my number one tip from this whole video is that A, if you're going to be shooting with narrowband during the full moon or in a region where there's not a lot of bright stars, try and focus your lens on Polaris or something else with the Bahtinov mask with the filters in place. That way, when you actually find the object, it should be pre-focused. But don't forget that hydrogen alpha, oxygen, and sulfur, they're all going to have different focal points. So that way, even if it's sharp with hydrogen alpha, it doesn't mean it's going to be sharp with the other two filters. So you can see that there are some problems doing this. That's where maybe that electronic focuser might come in handy that ZWO has. Something more to consider, but I still like doing things the hard way and giving myself a challenge every night, apparently. And even if the data was good, I still messed up the live stacking, which we talked about. And as I mentioned, I don't even like doing live stacking now that I've seen you have to do everything before taking your light frames. To me, that doesn't work out. I'd rather take those after my light frames and just do it all in post. And for my final image, as you saw, it was too blurry to do anything with. And this is really all I got out of it at the end of the day. I'm not really happy with it, but I learned a lot. And on my next night, I can fix 90 to 100% of the problems I encountered. And I should be able to get a lot better of a final photo than this, which is not good at all. So thanks for watching. Hopefully this video will save you from making the mistakes I did, and you'll have a bit of a smoother night. Maybe now you know how to do live stacking a little bit better, or maybe you don't even want to waste your time with it. And looking ahead to the rest of the dedicated Astro course, I still have a lot of videos I want to do, and I want to get back to me actually showing you how to do things rather than me explaining all my failures. But I thought, at least for these past two videos, it would be good to show you the mistakes I made. That way you don't repeat them as well.